this hype cycle has pushed expectations so sky high that the reality, even if it is incredible, can still sometimes seem disappointing. When am I going to get AI-generated content that isn't cringe? When am I going to be able to just fully automate all of my workflows and fire all my software engineers? And none of that has become a reality yet.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein, and welcome to TSP Reacts for 2025. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the progress that has been made towards artificial general intelligence. Has OpenAI secretly announced artificial general intelligence and we all just missed it? This is also going to be the year of robotics. Learn how the quiet progress of robots alongside AI is going to change the world for all of us. And finally, in 2025, we've got a new American administration. President Donald Trump is back. Tech leaders are taking a completely different attitude to the relationship with government than they ever have before. Learn what they're doing and why it matters for you and your startup. All that and more in today's episode of TSP Reacts. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's vanta.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, before we get started on today's show, we first go to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact. If you've been listening to just a few of the episodes and getting value, we only ask for a few things in return. Please subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting app and give us a rating and a review over there. Subscribe to us on YouTube and give us a shout out on your favorite social network. It helps us grow the show, helps us feed the algorithm, and help more founders just like you. All right, with that, let's get into it.
Okay, so it's been a few weeks since our last episode of TSP Reacts, and over the Christmas holiday break, normally not that much happens in tech or in anything else, but in the world of AI, progress never stops. And in fact, it's been a big few weeks, Chris, for competition in general and for progress towards AGI, or artificial general intelligence. So let's start by talking about OpenAI's new O3 model. This is their latest frontier model. As far as I can tell, it's not yet available even for a public beta, but they've released some numbers, some benchmarking numbers and some demos that are really impressive. And the one that I thought might be worth discussing is its huge progress on a benchmark called ARC AGI. So that's ARC AGI. And the ARC prize is a benchmark that is designed by a guy called Francois Chalais. We've actually mentioned this one before on the show. He's one of the leading AI researchers in the world, and he created this benchmark with the intention of it being specifically difficult for LLMs to solve. And so that the idea being, if you actually make progress on this benchmark, you are making progress towards creative thinking, towards problem solving, and fundamentally towards true intelligence. And O3 has blown all existing models out of the water on this particular test. It is scoring, I think that the tuned version is getting 88%. O1, for what it's worth, was only getting 32% on this benchmark. So we've gone from 32% to 88%. 88% is actually about as good as a smart human can get on this benchmark. So that is really amazing progress. And of course, every time, I think it's easy to move the goalposts. You can say, oh, well, maybe this ARC AGI benchmark wasn't hard enough and we should come up with a new benchmark. But to me, Chris, I'd be interested in your thoughts. The more benchmarks these things can do, like the more LLMs are able to do so many different things and generalize in so many different ways, the question of whether it is true AGI becomes more and more academic because they're just capable of so much and so many things that humans can do.
Yeah, I was watching each day of the 12 days announcements with bated breath, sitting there waiting for each one to start, each live stream. And, as you said, we talked a lot about the first 5 or so days in Reacts last year. The O3 announcement shook me. I actually posted some stories on Instagram reacting quite quite emotionally to it. The takeaway that I took from it was that it was low key as good or better than most human beings at most activities. Period. If that isn't AGI, I don't know what is. The benchmarks they showed were in mathematics and this ARC test you're referring to that was, intended to be uniquely human in its puzzle solving abilities. And they just kind of casually demonstrated results that were exceeding that of most human beings. And I'm just sitting there like, there's a new Bill Maher special out on HBO saying, is everyone else seeing this? And it seemed like the response was relatively muted. Like I would have expected CNN to get on, say OpenAI has basically got AGI in their laps. I just feel like the profundity of what they've said and the understated way in which they said it seems to be at odds with the reality. And I'm just so deeply impressed, shaken, excited, fearful, thrilled, all at the same time. I really do think it's been underreported and understated how important O3 is. And to connect it to the other thing we wanted to talk about, which is Sam's post on AGI, a lot of that post is recapping and reaffirming their mission, but there's a paragraph or two in there toward the end, which is, we have line of sight to AGI, and we're going to basically hit that this year, and and then we're going to turn our attention to superintelligence. It's like, huh? What? Excuse me? Firstly, how is O3, if the benchmarks are to be believed, not AGI? It's already as good or better than most human beings. And secondly, that's a fairly casual thing to write buried in a blog post, that you just kind of release over the break. And then, oh boy, here comes Skynet for the next challenge. So
yeah,
as I said, I have all the feelings, and everyone was always quick, or a lot of people are quick to point out, like, no need to over exaggerate. People will just digest this and keep rolling, and it's not going to be that big a difference. And I think that's true until it's not, and I'm very interested to see what happens next.
So just a quick side note for listeners. So when we talk about AGI, or artificial general intelligence, and Sam specifically said, as we've traditionally thought of it, that is a level of intelligence that approximately matches a human being across a wide range of tasks that a human being might do, cognitive tasks. Superintelligence is the next step, right? Which is an intelligence that significantly exceeds the intelligence of human beings, right? So in a sense, if you think about the development of AI systems, a human level of intelligence is a nearly arbitrary milestone along the path of progress. And so you hit AGI and then you just kind of keep going into superintelligence. And that's what Sam is saying. But Chris, I've got a bunch of thoughts here that I'm going to try to structure. There are a number of reactions. This is a Reacts episode to some of the things that you're saying. So first of all, for the fact that people are not reacting as strongly to this as you might expect, I think there are a few things happening there, right? One is humans' ability to adapt to anything and everything is incredible, right? So, something that was magical 6 months ago becomes everyday today. And in fact, if you look at the frontier LLMs and people talk about ChatGPT or whatever, and they focus on its flaws, right? Not at the incredible technology that just 2 years ago you could barely have imagined interacting with every day, but we talk about its flaws. And so I think that's one reason why it's sort of underreported. The second point I wanted to make is that I think we are in a very strong hype cycle, right? And so there's this classic Gartner hype cycle. Generally, when a new technology emerges, at first it gets kind of over-egged and people expect even more from it than it delivers. And then you get the sort of the trough of despair and disappointment, and then you kind of level out to the actual impact the technology provides. And you would kind of think with the level of technology happening here and the level of progress happening here, you might be immune to the hype cycle, but I don't think that's the case at all, right? Because in effect, you can say that surprise or disappointment are a gap between your expectations and the reality. And so this hype cycle has pushed expectations so sky high that the reality, even if it is incredible, can still sometimes seem disappointing, right? And, the truth is, I think a lot of folks have tried to incorporate AI into their workflows, into their business, into their product. And it's not that easy, right? And the flaws of modern LLMs still often get in the way of being able to create incredible products. So they create incredible demos. It can be really useful, but I think the full promise of AI and LLMs has still not come to fruition. And so people can be like, oh, well, here's another announcement from OpenAI and it's even more impressive and It's hitting the benchmarks, but when am I going to get an AI SDR that doesn't suck? When am I going to get AI generated content that isn't cringe? When am I going to be able to just fully automate all of my workflows and fire all my software engineers? And none of that has become a reality yet. And I think that's why people are kind of collectively somewhat shrugging their shoulders at this.
Yeah, it's what's it called? The uncanny valley, I think. An intellectual uncanny valley. So again, just to recap for those who don't know, I'm sure most of the listeners do, there's this concept of the uncanny valley, where the more and more realistic a face gets, the more and more drawn to it emotionally we are. So think of cartoons or robot faces. The more realistic they get, the more we get drawn to them. And then there is this kind of cliff face where the face is very realistic, but not realistic enough. And our emotional kind of attachment, our emotional attraction plummets because the face starts to look real but sick, or real
creepy.
But
creepy is the word, I think.
Yes, but they think that it's related to the human being perceiving illness. It's something you get you kind of want to recoil from. And so there's this valley of affection that humans feel, and then once it becomes fully real, then that affection spikes up again. So we can love everything from two dots and a Skinner arc for two eyes and a mouth, all the way through to cartoons and 3D animation. But when that animation, that 3D model looks just a bit off, we recoil. And that trough there is called the uncanny valley. And it seems like AI sometimes strays into this intellectual uncanny valley where it seems realistic, but close enough to be a human, but not quite close enough. And you're like, ugh, that's so canned or so robotic. And you're right. When you look really close, AI falls into that uncanny valley a little more often than we'd like. But as Sam has mentioned a couple of times, he's like, look, we've blown past the Turing test, and people seem to, it's just been another Sunday. And the Turing test seemed like this impossibility, this incredible thing that a machine will never be able to compose sentences like a human being. And also part of me feels like a lot of the reason that ChatGPT is somewhat robotic is it's almost been asked to be. I feel like in the reinforcement learning and in the requirements that it's been given, it's been asked to be excessively polite, deferential, prompting, and almost, I feel like it's become more robotic. And I feel like that's almost deliberate to push it a little bit more towards feeling like it's of service rather than it's a creature with a soul. And, maybe I'm misreading the tea leaves here, but I've actually wondered to myself, I wonder if there's a way in the memory and the general instructions in the system message to say to it, I want you to act as human-like and as casual as possible. And I want you to try to deceive the person on the other end, whether it might not actually become more human-like than the general consumer version of ChatGPT. But I agree with you, Yaniv, that when they look at it really close, it seems to just fall just that little bit short. It feels like just a matter of time, and that's obviously what Sam is signaling in his AGI post. And that seems to be where it's going.
That's right. And also, just before we move on from this, though, I have a third theory that I haven't seen kind of raised too much on why people are less impressed with this stuff than they should be. And this is something that I've felt personally, which is, unlike many other systems, it's quite difficult to evaluate an intelligence, right? And in the same way, we talk about in the startup podcast and elsewhere, how hard it is to hire people, right? Because you've got this sort of general intelligence inside someone's head, and you're trying to figure out how good they are at various things. And so when you've got an LLM, it's an intelligence. Of course, you can read all the stuff about the benchmarks and so on, but when I hear, oh, there's a new model, what do? I fire up ChatGPT, I fire up Gemini, whatever, and I check it out. And I realize now that the capabilities of these models have gone way beyond the way that I interview them, right, Chris? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, I have a chat with them and I'm like, oh, write me a LinkedIn post or let's talk about this topic. But actually, these things are really good at advanced maths and at planning and all of this stuff, right? So if you don't actually think about the types of tasks that these intelligences are now progressing on, and you sort of stick to the general, oh, let's have a conversation, let's create content, which is a very small aspect of intelligence and a very small aspect of these LLMs, it can often feel like, for example, O1 isn't really better than ChatGPT 4, right, in a lot of ways. But then you stretch it, right? You give it difficult tasks and it massively outstrips it. And so I actually think we're at this point where a new model doesn't hit people viscerally in the same way that, the move from ChatGPT 3 to ChatGPT-4 is because they have these much more specialized capabilities. And so you don't get that visceral sense of, oh, this is new, right? There's just an intelligence sitting behind a blinking cursor. In a lot of ways, it seems the same as the old intelligence if you interact with it casually. And so that feeling of awe and wonder is actually more difficult to capture with these new models. They only show themselves when you apply them to specific real-world tasks, and that's not generally how people think about them. So yeah, interested in your reaction to that one.
Yeah, I think that's really astute, actually. I think that's really, really clever because we've almost developed a muscle memory for what we ask these agents to do, right? And so it's like, rewrite this thing, write me a shopping list. And so O1 or O3 eventually maybe is not much better at doing that because it's sort of done that, right? It's fine. It's a creative writing exercise. It knows how to do that. And so when you get a new one, you go, hey, write me a shopping list. And it's like, yeah, okay, here's the shopping list. But many people are not creative enough, intelligent enough, thoughtful enough, don't have enough time, pick your reason to sit there and go, right, let me give you a material science challenge to figure out and to see what it does. Yeah, I think you're right. When our muscle memory is just to keep asking it to do the thing we've already asked it to do.
And, I'd specifically, I like the analogy of interviewing someone for a job, right? Assessing the intelligence and the capability of a human is difficult. And so assessing the intelligence and the capability of a human-like intelligence should similarly be difficult, right? It's not something that you just, have a casual chat and figure it out. And yeah, if you take let's say a PhD in materials science and your job interview for them is like, write me a LinkedIn post or write me a shopping list, then, first of all, you're not going to be testing their true intelligence. And secondly, they might actually not be that great at that. And so, I just think it's a really interesting thing where it used to be quite easy to evaluate a piece of software and its capabilities and so on because they were well-defined and they were human-defined. And now in the same way as we've talked about the interface challenges, Chris, of AIs, where it's just a prompt and the behavior is, in a sense, undefined, I think just evaluating their quality subjectively as opposed to objectively by looking at benchmarks is increasingly difficult.
I know a way to evaluate their intelligence and their efficacy is to ask them to redesign OpenAI's product marketing and naming conventions so that they're easier to follow.
Oh my God.
And more self-describing.
Just unbelievable, isn't it?
I love the announcement. He's like, we're releasing the next version of O1 and, you'd expect it to be called O2, but in our continued effort to have the worst possible names in history, we're calling it O3. And people are like, what? What does that mean? They've obviously run into some trademark issue with France Telecom or whatever, O2.
Yeah, worst naming convention since Windows back in the XP days. Just before we kind of move on from AI, Chris, the other thing I wanted to note that's kind of happened since the beginning of the 12 days of OpenAI is Google. I don't know if this was planned or not, could have been coincidental, or it could have been a rare example of them being reactive and moving quickly. About halfway through the 12 days of OpenAI, Google kind of started doing the 12 days of Gemini and made some incredible announcements from Gemini, which is Google's AI suite. And I think, in particular, they announced Gemini 2.0, which is their new frontier model. And these days, when you have these models, you normally have a couple of different levels, right? You have the sort of the giant one with billions of parameters or hundreds of billions of parameters, and then you have smaller ones with millions of parameters. And the fascinating thing for me about this one, Chris, for me, the takeaway is Gemini 2.0 Flash, which is their small millions of parameters model, really fast, much cheaper, outperforms Gemini 1.5 Pro, which was their frontier model and is up there with ChatGPT 4.0 and so on in terms of its performance. And so the takeaway for you running a startup is, first of all, you can get access to much cheaper tokens for Flash. It's also much faster because these small models just tend to be more responsive in terms of inference. And I heard this term the other day that I think is, I'm not sure how formally you measure it, but I think the concept is quite intuitive and grokkable, which is cost per intelligence, right? Because you can't say, oh, the cost per token is going down or up, because it depends on the model. But if you kind of triangulate the cost for a token at a given level of model intelligence, it just keeps going down and down and down. Gemini 2.0 Flash is another massive improvement in cost per intelligence. So you can now get ChatGPT 4 level intelligence or even smarter for a fraction of the cost that you would have had to pay for ChatGPT 4 just 6 months ago. So I think that's exciting. And I think Google is catching up fast.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the OpenAI announcements were similar, right? It was like the mini version of O3 is just as powerful as the pro version of O1. What struck me actually about their announcements was particularly Project Mariner has this browser plugin or this ability to be baked into Chrome. Human and I were actually talking about how Google has to hesitate to bake Gemini into Chrome because of the antitrust, the inspections, and the kind of the focus that's being paid on them by the government. They can't make Chrome, like bundle Gemini into Chrome, because they're gonna get a lot of scrutiny. The reality is there's been a regime change and an attitude change like almost overnight. And you better believe that Trump's administration is going to be all about American companies growing bigger, faster, and more powerful than the rest of the world. And, his priority is trying to read the tea leaves and try to make sense of his capricious perspective on everything. He just wants America to win, period. And he wants growth at all costs. And so I think this idea of like, hey, let's look into antitrust and let's look at labor rights is going to take a backseat to Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, NVIDIA need to win the AI race, period, full stop. And so I think all of that antitrust stuff is going to go out the window. And I think we're going to start to see browsers, especially Google browsers, with AI baked in. That's going to be exciting from a kind of an AI innovation point of view. If you're having a startup that might be, derailed by Google's anti-competitive behavior, maybe not so exciting.
I think that's a really good insight. I think it is quite possibly not a coincidence that Google made these announcements that may have attracted antitrust scrutiny, just as the Trump regime is starting to go into office. Now, there's two other sort of points I would make here, right? First of all, competition is good, right? And I think what we're seeing is OpenAI versus Google and a whole bunch of the others are now pushing each other forward aggressively. There was a while where OpenAI was well ahead of the competition, and while you could never accuse them of moving slowly, it does feel like they've put their foot on the gas even a bit more. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's because they're actually feeling the heat of competition. So the progress is happening fast. And the other thing is, this is an observation that we made on this show, Chris, last year several times, is that this is still in a lot of ways Google's race to lose, right? Their main challenge is to get out of their own way. They've got the distribution, they've got the raw technology, they've got the engineers, they've got the product integration. They've got so much going for them on the AI side. And they were caught flat-footed and, they're not the best managed company in the world. But one of the things that we said is they're going to get multiple shots on goal, right? They can afford to screw up a number of times and still come out ahead. And it does feel like they're starting to get out of their own way. They're starting to screw up less. I've also noticed, for example, the AI summaries on Google search results. I don't know if you've seen this, Chris, have started to become useful. For a long time, they were rubbish. And now I'm like, oh, okay, I often don't scroll down to the links because the AI has told me what I need to know. And so I've just got to say, I feel like we come back in 12 months and there's better than even odds that we're like, wow, Google's really running away with this. It was a really impressive set of announcements back in December.
I'm trying to find a way to describe this that reflects the nuance of how I think about it, because there's a lot of nuance underneath. But There are many things that Trump's surrogates describe, oftentimes inarticulately or belligerently or without empathy, that I actually agree with. And I deliberately talk about Trump's surrogates because Trump can't string a sentence together to save his life. And I deliberately say that, the way they say these things are often callous or without empathy for people not in their position. But there are certain things that I think are actually true and good for the US and potentially good for innovation and technology. One of the things that I'm circling around to really believe is, as we all know, with a major platform shift, the deck is shuffled and new winners and losers emerge. And so if you have massive antitrust scrutiny during a massive technology shift, as Microsoft did during the mobile era, then all you're doing is hobbling some of your best innovators and cutting them off at the knees just as they're trying to survive a platform shift. And so Microsoft was severely undermined during the desktop to mobile shift and to the internet shift, which left one of the major consumer players, unfairly disadvantaged, I think. Maybe some would argue they were fairly disadvantaged. But Google cannot afford this antitrust scrutiny while they're trying to compete. And they're in the middle of a very competitive landscape. They are no longer the monopoly in AI, right? And so they need to be at full strength to compete with Microsoft, to compete with Apple, to compete with OpenAI, to compete with Perplexity, compete with whatever. And so this is not a time for the Justice Department to go, hey, what about that browser that you guys own? It's like, fuck off. Like they let them innovate. And also, it's not just about the kind of the climate internally, the domestic climate. It's also about the macroeconomic global competitive climate. We do need, let's say, US companies or Western companies, Western powers to win the AI race. And so, all of that combined, I tend to think that Trump, either strategically or, through being a bumbling idiot, has stumbled into the right idea for the right time, which is we need to unlock innovation and growth in these major players, lest US's dominance be threatened. Now, there's a whole other conversation to be had about the ethics and morality and benefit of US dominance, which we can have another day.
Maybe. It's definitely a complicated topic, antitrust.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I wanted to semi-segue. I feel this is somewhat still in the realm of AI. I wanted to make maybe a bit of a prediction for 2025, Chris, which is 2025, as well as maybe the AGI and the singularity, is going to be the year of robots. If we're following the plot line of Terminator 2, then this is also part of it. I saw a most incredible demo. Like we said, we've been pretty spoiled in terms of robots and AI, and it can be easy to be blasé. I saw this demo that at first I thought was AI generated. It was that incredible. It was of the Unitree Go2W all-terrain robot. Is this robot sort of dog on wheels, and it can walk, it can drive, it can like jump off cliffs. It is the most incredibly dexterous thing you've ever seen. It's more lithe than a cheetah, and it's just absolutely incredible in terms of its physical maneuvering. And so in the same way as we've kind of approaching AGI or super intelligence, we're getting this kind of super physicality from robots where it's like, okay, they can outperform not just humans, but all animals and vehicles that we know about in terms of their ability to just move through the world. This is not unrelated to AI, because I think there is both the physical aspect of robots, and then there's actually a lot of machine learning and AI that goes into programming the movements and their ability to navigate through the world. But, you start to see now that you're going to have AI and LLMs as a sort of disembodied intelligence, but we're also going to be able to embody intelligence, and it's going to happen a lot sooner than you think. And again, I think the impressive stuff happens at the top end, where we see, okay, these incredible robots that do amazing things. But I saw another announcement, and I can't find it right now, so this is bad researching by me, bad podcaster. But there's a Chinese company that announced a very capable robot for sub $10,000. It's now getting to the level where a moderately well-off family could buy its own robot and, start using it for domestic help. And so, I think, again, if we come to the end of 2025, the kind of general purpose robot moving through the world is going to be less science fiction, and it's going to start being something that we see in our world and something we start thinking about as part of every day.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. At the same time that we're having a revolution in reasoning, we're also having a revolution in physical robotics and servos and all the parts and materials that make these things work. And, we now have robots that seem to be dexterous and stable and have sufficient battery power and battery density to walk around the world for meaningful periods of time. It is an incredible kind of confluence of events that we have, robotics and reasoning, artificial bodies and artificial brains coming together at the same time. And some of that is not a coincidence. These things are feeding each other, and some of it is a wonderful kind of intersection of timing. I do think, the next 5-10 years is going to be equally an explosion in intelligence work and physical labor. It's going to be crazy. It is worth knowing a few things. Number one, we already have an explosion in robotics happening right now. So one of the benefits of living in Silicon Valley and in some of the cities in the US is you live in the future. Right now, there are Waymo robots taking people on rides every minute of every day. They had just hit 4 million rides at the end of last year. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they just hit 5 million rides. So it took them all the time since their founding to the end of last year to hit 4 million, and they've already hit 5 million. So they're on an exponential curve. That's number one. So that there is already mass scale robot rollout happening right now in cities in the US. The other thing to keep in mind is that NVIDIA is way ahead of this curve. There are many individual robotics efforts where they're developing individualized kind of world simulation, models and so on. But NVIDIA is building a computing platform for robotics. And Jensen talks about the three computers, the training computer, the simulation computer, and the runtime computer. Holy crap. He now has the picks and shuffles to generate reasoning engines and the picks and shovels to generate embodied intelligence in the form of robots. NVIDIA is already and is set up to be even more so the most consequential company in the history of the world. And I have my portfolio is way overbalanced, overinvested, overindexed on NVIDIA because I just invested and it grew some 3 or 4 times. I have not rebalanced my portfolio. I am basically heavy NVIDIA. That's not just because of their picks and shovels and their GPUs for LLMs, but also for robotics and also for all of the hidden revolutions that people can't see or understand. Biology, material science, manufacturing. These guys are running the substrate of the planet, or rather they're building the tool chain to run the substrate of the entire planet. And so, wow, it's just like crazy time for them and for the whole world.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Well, this is time for a big mood shift on this podcast, Chris, from the amazing future of robotics and AI to tech leaders taking a vow of fealty and taking the knee and kissing the ring of the incoming administration and Donald Trump. So we're recording this on the 14th of January. It is 1 week away from the inauguration of Donald Trump. And what we are seeing is tech companies all over the place just falling over themselves to unwind, I guess, a lot of the things that they've done over the last few years and really align themselves a lot more with the Donald Trump MAGA worldview. So we talked, and I think, Chris, you and Human did quite a good job last time talking about some of the actual tech folks coming into the administration. But now let's talk about, for example, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. So Mark Zuckerberg has both vibe shifted in terms of what he says, right? He went on the Joe Rogan podcast and said a whole bunch of things about freedom of speech and about how the industry needs more masculine energy. And this is really quite regressive sort of bro sort of stuff. But also there've been some really significant changes at Meta. So let's start with some of the leadership, right? Nick Clegg was Meta's head of policy. And he was, before he was at Meta, he was a centrist politician from the UK who, said all the right things and, was somewhat progressive and so on. He's now been replaced by a prominent Republican called Joel Kaplan. And so straight away, this is signaling a change. It's a sort of a vibe shift and a real shift in terms of how Facebook thinks about policy and how Facebook is going to go forward. And straight away, there have been these changes. For example, to fact-checking is now being removed, Chris. That's a huge change. Facebook's hate speech policies have become more liberal. They've moved away from their internal DEI policies. And so all of these things that have kind of been Republican talking points and whipping boys, Facebook is stepping away from. And one other thing I would point out is that there have been some changes to Facebook's board of directors. I think one very prominent change is that Dana White, who is the head of the UFC, closely allied with Joe Rogan and the Republican Party, is now on the board. And so again, I think if you go back in time 15, 20 years ago, or even less, Silicon Valley was a sort of left-wing, capital P progressive sort of place, quite strongly aligned with Democrats and so on. And now it's a complete 180, right? Where we are seeing, maybe not the employees, but we're seeing the leaders align themselves very closely with the new regime. And it's fascinating. And to me, at least, Chris, I think it's kind of scary.
Look, this is really complicated. And I started to touch on it earlier. I think this is a tale of two cities. On one hand, there is truth to some of what Trump's surrogates, puppet masters, advocates talk about. There have been some fundamental problems around focusing on regulation through litigation and slow walking development versus focusing on growth. There has been regulation through litigation and FUD instead of embracing a new financial system like Bitcoin. It is true that the US government is a giant bureaucratic mess. People like to laugh about the DMV, but it is operated in such an unwieldy and inefficient way, with laws and processes and systems and departments that are archaic and almost designed to be anti-human, anti-citizen. It is true that there are DEI programs that are anti-meritocratic. That is true. And I actually have been in a meeting. I've been in a situation where I was judging a hackathon, for example, and literally the judging room started with, we're going to make sure a woman wins, right? These things, there is truth to them. However, the human beings, the individuals who are espousing these truths from Donald Trump down are capricious, have two-dimensional thinking where they're willing to move fast and break things. And unfortunately, they're breaking livelihoods for people, often the most vulnerable. They lack empathy. They're bullies. And in some cases, they're anti-democratic and criminal. So you can both believe in a pro-growth, pro-Bitcoin, pro-innovation, pro-American supremacy even, or manifest destiny agenda, while also believing that people who call for, the overthrow of a fair election are the wrong people to facilitate such a change. And the last point I'll make is that some of the problems they're pointing to, lack of faith in institutions, criminality, and so on and so forth, are the result of their own actions of the Republican Party undermining American democracy, belief in institutions, truth, justice, and the American way. And so it is such a complicated web of thoughts and feelings you have to have about this. It's not enough to say Trump administration bad, Kamala good. It's not enough to say Kamala incompetent, which is a fucking lie. Trump is competent. No, that's just dumb. But I've started to develop very, very mixed feelings about the whole thing and taking a somewhat of a wait and see approach. And, I've got my Australian passport ready to go to fly back to the safety of our beautiful country. So we'll see how it goes.
I sort of half-ish agree with you, but I think I would take a more extreme view of this, right? Which is, it's easy to point out problems with how the world works, with how governments run. And yes, okay, there are bureaucracies, there are some excesses, for example, in diversity programs and so on. My big issue with this incoming regime and their surrogates, Chris, is I see a total lack of good faith. I don't believe they are there to fix the problems. They are there to blow things up and make the world a more comfortable place for themselves and people like themselves, right? Like, you look at the Department of Government Efficiency, which is not a department, right? Hasn't been set up properly. And sure, okay, they haven't started doing anything yet, but they're just talking about like blowing up entire departments, running this thing like Twitter or X, and getting rid of really important things and not doing the hard work of real reform, right? Of course, it would be good to improve the efficiency of government, but you can't start from a position of hating government, of not believing that government provides any value, which is patently false. And anybody who does that, I can't engage in a good faith argument with someone who thinks that governments are evil when you have a look at everything that we have today and the important role that government has played in that. So it's just nuts, right? You can't say, oh, some diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have gone too far, so let's just get rid of them and let's pretend that the status quo of, certain groups, in particular men from certain ethnic backgrounds kind of being overrepresented in all the positions of power is a reflection of meritocracy, when it clearly isn't, right? If something is not optimal, then you fix it. You don't blow it up. You don't hate on it. And so these people, they're just there to destroy. That's what I see, Chris. And so it doesn't matter if they have some basic insights that are like, true. It's because those things are being weaponized for destruction rather than to make the world a better place and to build on what those before them have accomplished and make them better. Whatever credit you're giving them, I feel you're giving them a bit too much.
Well, I'm only giving them a sliver of credit because I think the conversation is often all too lacking in nuance. And you're right that the Republican Party in general, although it's unrecognizable now, has always been very good at pointing out social wedge issues in order to win elections and then basically economically rape the country and to ensure that there's a massive redistribution of wealth to the top and then to basically redistrict and jerry-rig so they can try to reinforce their power.
But you meant gerrymander, right?
I did mean gerrymander, yes. And so you're right that this may also be just another form of that, which is, well, we're going to use this kind of pro-growth, pro-whatever agenda to capture people's sense of being mired in, in bureaucracy, to then come and basically reorganize the world, kind of to allow Elon Musk to do whatever the hell he wants, and to accrue all that power for himself. But look, the real topic here, we're a startup and tech podcast. This is really about how the tech leaders are reacting to this. And, the one I want to speak about first and maybe most is Zuckerberg and his move to turn off fact-checking and to turn off DEI programs. I got a couple of feelings about this. Number one, I was a bit surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I was a bit surprised that he would turn off the fact-checking system that they designed, because I've been on record on this show multiple times speaking about both how I admire the surgical nature that he's tried, the restrained nature in which he's tried to take some responsibility for the conversation without muting dissenting voices and conversation. And they've been accused of doing too much by the right and too little by the left.
Which means it's probably about right.
Which means he's exactly about right. And I've been on this show defending him, saying, no, he's doing exactly the right amount. It's surgical, it's precise, and any calls for him to do more is at odds with also questioning the amount of power he has. Like, people are going, Mark Zuckerberg is too powerful. He should do more to control the conversation. It's like, I'm sorry, what? Which of those two things do you want? And the fact is, I believe he threaded the needle very, very well. And now it's sort of like this is the last step. He's gone kind of UFC fighter guy, relaxed hair and chain guy. And now it's like no DEI and moderation guy. He's like it's sort of snapped into focus. Oh shit, he's Joe Rogan Trump guy. He went full MAGA with one final, it clicked into place. I was like, what? When did that happen? So this is disappointing and demoralizing. On the DEI side, man, this conversation is so complicated and so fraught. Is there real problems with DEI in the world? Yes. Is there real problems with power differentials between men and women in the workplace and other places? Yes. Have some of these DEI programs, and when I say some, I mean too many, been used as a cudgel, been used to diminish or put a chill in the air for frank and honest conversations about the role of men and women, of work, of work-life balance, of race and equity and equality? Yes. We need to find a way to include everybody in the conversation and to not make that conversation the only conversation. It's a very, very complicated line to walk. I reject the all-in podcast narrative, which is these things are wholesale bad and there is no merit to them whatsoever. And I reject the liberal narrative, which is like power structures and the patriarchy is the cause of all evil. That is not true either. There is something in the middle, and we need to find it. And we need to continue to kind of collaborate as human beings.
I largely agree with you. And again, my issue with the incoming administration and then now folks like Zuckerberg who are aligning themselves with it is a lack of good faith. They want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They want to go back to how things were. You can't say, oh, well, existing DEI programs weren't fit for purpose and they were going too far, so we're going to end them. But we still care about diversity, because he then goes on Joe Rogan's podcast and he says, what business needs is more masculine energy. I mean, Jesus Christ, this is not good faith. This is just men wanting to go back to the future, right? To go back to a world that was convenient for them, where they didn't have to consider other perspectives, where they didn't have to be inclusive or sensitive to others. And it's not progress. It is the opposite of progress. Yes, was there overreach? Of course, right? And so when something goes too far, you pull it back in. You don't destroy it. And, I think anybody who says that before DEI programs, we were living in meritocracy is either an idiot or arguing in complete bad faith. And so, you can't get rid of DEI programs and not replace them with anything. That is not good faith arguing.
It's, I guess pretty much everything we've both said is about arguing for the virtue of balance and nuance.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to tell if some of these people are arguing in good faith or not. Some of them. Many of them are not. They are spineless, craven, hypocritical people. And I'm all the people who called Trump dangerous and deranged, who are now bending the knee, these people are the problem, and who speak without any nuance about what some of his virtues might be and some of his or all of his foibles. But I think there are a few on the fringes. Let's even Sam Altman, who was talking about some of the benefits that might come with the Trump administration, who speak with nuance, who genuinely want to see merit-based decision-making and pro-growth agenda without, I think, buying the whole MAGA bullshit hook, line, and sinker. I think you get Joe Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg, who are both, UFC nuts in a room. I think it's pretty easy to imagine how the conversation moves to masculine energy pretty quickly.
Yeah, but it's not okay. It's not okay to get rid of DEI programs and then say you need more masculine energy. Like, how are we going to get to true meritocracy with that attitude?
I'm also, quite disappointed with the whole, like, oh yeah, everyone's going to put in $1 million. It's like they're paying their vig, right? It's like a mob boss.
There's definitely mob vibes. So, again, I think the fascinating thing about the second Trump term is folks seem to have accepted that the president of the United States now is a transactional person who is not ruling or governing for the greater good, but is a sort of very transactional person who you need to kiss the ring, you need to take fealty, you need to give him something in order to get something in return, right? And if you are powerful, the way to stay powerful is to align yourself with Trump, right? And of course, the person who did it first and did it best was Elon Musk. And now everyone's following, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos has also become a craven toady, which is really disappointing. He's the owner of the Washington Post. He was doing a good job for a long time. And now he's stepping in and basically censoring anything that is critical of himself or Trump. It's pretty disappointing to see all of these powerful folks who are just completely rolling over and saying, you know what, the way I retain my power is by doing what President Trump wants me to do.
It's disappointing to see. And then if this goes the worst case scenario, it's going to be horrifying to see. Now, here's the good news. Let's end on a positive note. I've been on record saying, he has no checks and balances. He controls, the executive, the judicial, the legislature, and in some ways he owns the media as well, or at least massive media apparatus. And so I've been saying, like, guys, there's no checks on this guy's power. The good news is, he has barely a hair's breadth control of the House. He does not have unanimous support from his party in there. And there's only so much he can get done. And, the US has been characterized by backlashes to backlashes to backlashes through much of its history. You could argue that there has been a culture war to inculcate DEI, woke, what they would classify as anti-meritocratic values, and let's say low growth or anti-growth policies for quite some time. I'm taking their position here. I'm not saying I believe this. And this is a backlash to that. The bark may be worse than the bite because they can't actually do everything they want to do. We'll have 4 years of this, transactional, cynical, anti-woke, whatever. And then there'll be another backlash. And there'll be people who look for a much more ethical, moral, aspirational leader, the next Barack Obama. And then they'll come in and they'll do the next thing. Of course, all of that breaks if he truly breaks the institutions of democracy. And I think he's done a lot to already achieve that result. And so we'll have to hold on to our butts and see what happens for the next 4 years.
All right, Chris. Well, with butt holding, it seems like a wonderful place to end the episode. Hold on to each other's butts, everybody. 2025 is going to be a fantastic year for the Startup Podcast. I'm so glad to be back, and we'll be doing this now every week for all of 2025. Thanks for being such a great co-host, Chris. Looking forward to doing this with you.
So great to have you back on a consistent basis now, Yaniv, and we'll have a really exciting set of guests to join us as the third and fourth panelists here and there throughout the weeks, and looking forward to going on this journey with you guys. Please don't hesitate. In fact, we encourage you to send us feedback in the comments and emails and what have you. We'd love to hear from you guys, and we'd love to know how we're doing, how we should improve, and how to ultimately make sure the show is delivering maximum value. Yaniv, how can people find you on the internet?
All right, so the best place to find me is I am on LinkedIn, trying to make it a less boring place while maintaining my own sanity. I got a talking to from my wife the other day saying that I'm spending too much time on LinkedIn, which is no doubt true, but So I'm going to try to cut back, but I will still be there. So I love getting connection requests from a TSP listener. I just got one as the show was recording, and so I'll always accept them if you say you come from TSP. And yeah, that's the best place to find me. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, you can find me on chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter to sign up to my newsletter, or on all the social media at Chris Saad. Give us a follow and I'll be happy to chat there. Otherwise, you'll see me on this show twice a week and maybe more throughout the rest of the year. All right, Yaniv, great to catch up, man.
Have a good one, mate. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.